Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. When an elderly woman walked into a Chicago courtroom, no one took her seriously. Judge Richard Calloway mocked her. The young attorneys laughed, and the prosecution believed they had an easy victory. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Margaret Whitmore wasn't just any retired grandmother. She was once the most formidable attorney in the city. What started as a simple legal case quickly unraveled into something much bigger, a battle against corruption, hidden power, and an old enemy who had returned from the shadows. Subscribe now to Life Stories to begin today's story. The courtroom was alive with the kind of energy that thrived on spectacle. People shifting in their seats, whispers exchanged behind hands, and that underlying hum of anticipation. Like a brewing storm. I had seen this before, the kind of eager amusement that came from watching someone about to be put in their place. Judge Richard Calloway leaned back in his oversized leather chair, shaking his head with a smirk that barely concealed his delight. He was enjoying this, the absurdity of it, the supposed joke standing before him. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. His eyes, sharp and condescending, fixed on me, a woman well past what society would call her prime. "Ma'am," he continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you lost? This is a court of law, not a knitting club. Did you wander in here looking for your grandchildren?" The laughter erupted almost immediately. Some of the younger lawyers in the room exchanged glances, nudging each other as if they had just been gifted an unexpected comedy routine. Even the bailiff had to clear his throat, suppressing the chuckle that threatened to slip through. It was a scene carefully orchestrated, one that painted me as a harmless old woman, stumbling into the wrong place. But I was not lost. I had never been lost a day in my life. I stood still, my hands resting lightly on the polished wooden table in front of me. A simple beige suit, neatly pressed, a silver bun secured at the nape of my neck. Nothing about me spoke of a woman here for a fight. And yet, I had come prepared for one. Judge Calloway's smirk widened as he leaned forward. "You actually think you can defend yourself in this case?" he scoffed. "An old lady like you? I mean, do you even know how to argue in a courtroom?" It was an attempt to belittle, to crush any shred of dignity I had left before this case even began. But if there was one lesson life had taught me, it was that people often revealed their weaknesses when they believed they had already won. I inhaled deeply, adjusting the lapels of my jacket with steady fingers. When I spoke, my voice was calm, unwavering. "Your Honor," I said, my words measured and firm. "I strongly advise you to choose your words carefully." The laughter died instantly. A silence swept through the room, quick and absolute, like a candle snuffed out in the wind. The judge's smirk faltered, if only for a second. He chuckled, though this time it sounded forced, the confidence behind it thinning. "Oh, and why is that?" I took a single step forward, the weight of my presence alone enough to shift the balance of the room. "Because," I said, my voice cutting through the air like the sharp edge of a blade, "I have won more cases than you have ever presided over, Judge Calloway, and you just made a very big mistake." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Someone actually dropped a pen, the clatter of it against the floor echoing in the heavy silence. Even the stenographer, a woman who had likely witnessed every kind of outburst imaginable, had paused, her fingers hovering uncertainly over her keyboard. Judge Calloway's smirk disappeared entirely. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles turning pale. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, lacking its earlier arrogance. I met his gaze head on. Margaret Whitmore. And for the first time in his career, Judge Richard Calloway had nothing to say. I did not take pleasure in humiliating people. I had never been the kind of person who sought victory at the expense of another's dignity. But there were moments in life when you had no choice but to remind the world exactly who you were. 2 days earlier, I had sat at a small cafe in downtown Chicago, stirring a packet of sugar into my tea, listening as 2 young lawyers laughed about my case at the table beside me. "I'm telling you, this case is a guaranteed win," one of them said, his voice brimming with the cocky overconfidence of youth. "That old lady doesn't stand a chance. It's open and shut." I had simply lifted an eyebrow, continuing to sip my tea, letting their words settle into my bones. Judge Calloway is going to tear her apart. The other lawyer added with a laugh. He's ruthless. You saw how he treated that nervous law student last month. What do you think he's going to do to some retired grandmother? I had calmly set my teacup down, adjusted my blazer, and walked out of the cafe, my heels clicking against the pavement. I wasn't just some retired grandmother. I was Margaret Whitmore, and I had a case to win. The world has a strange way of sorting people into neat little boxes. There are the young and ambitious, the powerful and untouchable, and then there are the forgotten, the ones who have stepped back, willingly or otherwise, from the fight. I had never seen myself as one of the forgotten, but it was clear that everyone else did. I could see it in the way those young lawyers had laughed about me in that cafe. I could feel it in the way the courtroom had dismissed me before I had even spoken. They saw my silver hair, my modest suit, the lines on my hands, and decided I was harmless. That had been their first mistake. I arrived home that evening, slipping my shoes off at the door, feeling the quiet hum of my apartment settle around me. I had lived alone for years now, long enough that solitude no longer felt lonely. The world outside bustled with noise, people moving too fast, always in a hurry. But I had learned, a long time ago, that moving quickly didn't always mean moving wisely. The old wooden desk in my study was covered with stacks of legal documents, case files, and highlighters. Some people had book clubs or gardening to keep their minds sharp in retirement. I had the law. I had never truly left it. I sat down, running my fingers over the faded text of an old zoning code book. This case wasn't just about proving my innocence. It wasn't even about winning. It was about reminding them all that I had never stopped being Margaret Whitmore. As the evening deepened and the lights of Chicago flickered outside my window, my phone rang. "Ma'am, I hope you know what you're doing," a hesitant voice said on the other end. It was Ethan Carter, my assistant, young, bright, and full of nerves. He had just graduated law school, still at the stage where he believed the world operated by the rules written in textbooks. He didn't yet understand the weight of experience. "Judge Calloway doesn't respect anyone," Ethan continued, his voice lowering. "Especially not someone like you." I smiled to myself, leaning back in my chair. "Like me?" He cleared his throat awkwardly. "I mean, someone experienced." "Ah," I said, amused. "So you think I should be worried?" "I think," he hesitated. "I think he's going to underestimate you." "Everyone is." "Good," I said simply. "That's exactly what I want." I could hear him shifting on the other end. Uneasy. "Ma'am, I know you're confident, but Calloway has a reputation. He's humiliated some of the best lawyers in this city. Then perhaps it's time someone humiliated him." Ethan sighed, but I could tell he was smiling. He was a good kid, full of the kind of moral conviction that reminded me of myself at his age. That conviction would be tested one day. But for now, I let him keep it. I spent the next few hours poring over every document related to my case. The accusations were ridiculous. A corporation claiming I had violated a zoning law in an attempt to force me off my own property. They assumed I would fold under the pressure. They assumed wrong. By the time dawn began to creep through my window, I had what I needed. Every loophole, every precedent, every buried exemption that had been written into law decades ago. Because the truth was, I didn't just know the law. I had written it. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse early, my steps measured and deliberate. I could feel their eyes on me, lawyers, clerks, the bailiff, watching, waiting for the inevitable moment when I would stumble. The bailiff, a young man barely out of his 20s, looked confused as I approached. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" I handed him a neatly folded document, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I believe I am." Moments later, the courtroom doors swung open, and I stepped inside, and that was when it all began. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, but I could feel the weight of skepticism pressing down on me like a lead blanket. The younger attorneys sat in the front row, watching with barely concealed amusement. They expected a show. They expected to see an old woman fumble and flounder under the weight of her own arrogance. Judge Calloway was no different. He sat tall, his robes hanging loosely over his shoulders, exuding the kind of authority that had been unchallenged for years. His expression was one of controlled condescension, as though he were entertaining a minor inconvenience rather than overseeing an actual trial. "Miss Whitmore," he said, leaning forward, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Since you insist on representing yourself, let me make this simple for you. Are you aware of the charges against you?" I met his gaze, unflinching. "I am." His smirk returned. "Then I assume you're also aware that the law is not something you can just walk into and expect to win?" I tilted my head slightly, as if considering his words. "And I assume you're aware that making assumptions in a courtroom is a dangerous thing?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Even the cocky young lawyers exchanged glances, sensing that something unexpected was happening. Judge Calloway's smirk faltered for the briefest of moments, but he quickly recovered, shifting his focus to the prosecution. "Mr. Grayson, you may begin." Michael Grayson, polished, expensive, and entirely too confident, rose from his seat. His navy blue suit was tailored perfectly, his posture radiating the certainty of a man who had never truly faced an obstacle he couldn't charm or intimidate his way through. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the jury, his voice smooth and practiced. "What we have here is a simple case. Miss Whitmore is in clear violation of city zoning laws." Objection. The word cut through the air before he had even finished his sentence. Grayson turned, stunned. "Excuse me?" Judge Calloway narrowed his eyes. "On what grounds?" I didn't look up from my documents as I flipped a page, my voice cool and steady. "On the grounds that Mr. Grayson just made a false statement." Grayson scoffed. "False? Miss Whitmore, the documents clearly show that." "The documents show what you want them to show," I interrupted, finally meeting his gaze. "But I'm afraid you've miscalculated." Judge Calloway's patience was thinning. "Miss Whitmore, you'd better have a solid reason for interrupting the prosecution." I nodded once. Then, with practiced ease, I lifted a single sheet of paper and held it up. "I do." Silence. Judge Calloway's eyes flickered to the document in my hand, his fingers tightening around his gavel. The entire courtroom waited, and then I said the words that changed everything. "With this, I can prove that everything Mr. Grayson just stated is completely false." Gasps spread across the room like wildfire. Someone whispered, "No way." The stenographer, who had been diligently typing away, actually paused. Judge Calloway's face paled. Grayson stiffened. I remained still, my arm steady as I held up the paper, the one document they had all failed to look for. Grayson took a hesitant step forward, shaking his head. "That's impossible," he muttered under his breath. I glanced at him, unimpressed. "Then by all means, Mr. Grayson," I said, holding the paper higher, "come and take a closer look." The hesitation in his stance was evident. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what to do. Judge Calloway cleared his throat, but his voice lacked the force it had held earlier. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "approach the bench." I didn't rush. I moved slowly, deliberately, the way I had walked in countless courtrooms before. Back when my name still carried weight. Back when no one had dared to underestimate me. I placed the document in front of Judge Calloway and stepped back, watching him closely as he adjusted his glasses and skimmed the paper. His face changed instantly. His smugness disappeared. His smirk dropped. His lips parted slightly as he scanned the contents again, as if he had misread them the first time. Grayson, still standing awkwardly in the middle of the courtroom, finally found his voice. "Your Honor," he said, shifting nervously. "What does it say?" Judge Calloway exhaled sharply and sat back in his chair. He tapped the paper once with his finger before slowly turning his eyes toward me. You had this all along?" I smiled slightly. "Of course." Calloway blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Grayson, growing impatient, rushed forward to grab the document. The moment his eyes scanned the page, his confidence shattered, his face drained of color, his fingers gripping the paper so tightly it almost crumpled. "No," he muttered. This can't be right." I tilted my head. "I assure you, Mr. Grayson," I said, my voice calm, "it's very much right." And just like that, the case was no longer theirs to control. The courtroom had turned into a pressure cooker. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, as Judge Calloway sat frozen in his chair. His hand still rested on the document I had placed before him. But his mind had clearly traveled elsewhere. The weight of realization was settling in. Across from me, Michael Grayson was struggling to keep his composure. His fingers gripped the document too tightly. His jaw clenched as he scanned it again and again, looking for an escape route. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice quieter now. "There isn't," I replied simply. Judge Calloway finally looked up, his expression unreadable. For the first time since this trial had begun, he wasn't smirking. He wasn't mocking me. He was seeing me for exactly who I was. "This document," he said, his voice slower, more careful now, "proves that your property was granted an exemption from zoning laws over 30 years ago." I nodded. "That's correct, Your Honor." Grayson swallowed hard, still holding onto his last shred of confidence. "Even if this document is real, we need to verify its authenticity. A piece of paper isn't enough to overturn an entire case." I turned to him, tilting my head slightly. "By all means, verify it. And while you do, I suggest you also pull my employment records from the city archives." Grayson's mouth opened, but no words came out. Judge Calloway narrowed his eyes. "And why is that, Miss Whitmore?" I clasped my hands in front of me, my voice steady. "Because I was the one who wrote the exemption, Your Honor, when I served as Chicago's chief zoning attorney." The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. The young lawyers in the front row, the same ones who had laughed at me earlier, now sat rigid in their seats. The bailiff, who had been suppressing his amusement before, was no longer smiling. Michael Grayson took a step back as though I had just struck him. "And Judge Calloway?" He looked stunned. "You expect me to believe that you personally wrote this exemption?" he asked, his voice sharper now. I met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor, because at the time, I wasn't just any attorney." I let the words linger in the air before adding, "I was the youngest chief zoning attorney in Chicago's history." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Whispers and frantic murmurs spread like wildfire. Even the stenographer, who had managed to stay professional through the entire trial, paused her typing, staring at me in shock. Judge Calloway banged his gavel. "Order, order in the court." Slowly, the noise died down, but the tension remained. He turned back to me, his expression unreadable. "If this is true, then why wasn't this document presented before now?" I raised an eyebrow. "Because no one bothered to look, Your Honor." The words hit the room like a hammer. Michael Grayson's face was turning red, not from anger, but from sheer humiliation. He had walked into this trial believing he would crush me, reduce me to nothing but a cautionary tale for his colleagues. Instead, he was being dismantled, piece by piece, in front of the entire courtroom. Judge Calloway exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. "This is highly irregular," he muttered. I folded my hands. "What's irregular, Your Honor?" My voice was polite, but firm. "That an elderly woman knows the law better than you?" A collective "oof" came from the gallery. Even the stenographer suppressed a smirk. Calloway's eyes darkened. "Watch yourself, Miss Whitmore." I didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I've been watching myself for over 60 years. And I've done just fine." The weight of my words settled over him like a final nail in a coffin. For the first time in his career, Judge Richard Calloway was losing control of his courtroom. But just as the chaos began to settle, something unexpected happened. The side doors burst open. A man in a dark suit strode inside. His movements urgent, his expression grim. He whispered something to the bailiff, who immediately turned toward the judge. Judge Calloway leaned forward as the bailiff murmured in his ear. His expression changed instantly. The arrogance, the confidence, it drained from his face like ink in water. His grip on the gavel loosened. And then, slowly, he turned back to me. His eyes, sharp and unforgiving just moments ago, were now filled with something I had never expected to see from him. Fear. The entire courtroom held its breath. Something had changed. Something big. And for the first time, Judge Calloway wasn't the one in control anymore. The moment the courtroom doors burst open, I knew something had shifted. It wasn't just about me anymore. There was something larger at play. Something lurking beneath the surface of this case that even Judge Calloway hadn't expected. His face had gone pale. His grip on the gavel loose. I had seen many reactions in a courtroom over the years: anger, arrogance, desperation, but fear? That was rare. Judge Calloway cleared his throat. But his voice lacked its usual command. "We are going to take a brief recess." Gasps rippled through the room. A recess? In the middle of a case that was about to be decided? That wasn't normal. Michael Grayson looked just as confused as the rest of us. "Your Honor, with all due respect." "Why?" The look Judge Calloway gave him shut him up immediately. "This court is in recess." His voice was strained, his gavel slamming down harder than necessary. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as people stood, stretching, exchanging puzzled glances. But I didn't move. I watched. Judge Calloway muttered something to the bailiff before stepping down from the bench. Without another word, he followed the man in the dark suit through a side door. Michael Grayson shot me a suspicious look before hurrying after them. Ethan Carter appeared at my side, his face tight with concern. "Miss Whitmore, what just happened?" I adjusted my jacket. "They just found something." Ethan swallowed. "Something about you?" I exhaled slowly, my eyes still fixed on the door Calloway had disappeared through. Without a doubt, I had seen this happen before. A case that seemed simple, suddenly revealing a tangled web beneath it. A truth no one had expected, or wanted, to find. Whatever had just been discovered, it had Judge Calloway rattled. And I needed to know why. 15 minutes earlier, inside Judge Calloway's private chambers, the man in the dark suit stood with his hands folded, his face unreadable. Judge Calloway paced the room, his face pale. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" The man nodded. "We double-checked the records. She is exactly who she says she is." Michael Grayson had rushed in moments earlier and was now flipping through a thick file in disbelief. His face stiffened as he skimmed the contents. "This can't be real," he whispered. Judge Calloway let out a humorless chuckle. "Oh, it's real." Grayson tightened his grip on the file. "How did we not know?" The man in the suit sighed. "Because she disappeared from the public eye decades ago. No interviews, no articles, no public statements. She erased herself from the legal world." Grayson swallowed hard. "But why?" Judge Calloway shook his head. "That's the question, isn't it?" He exhaled sharply. "But right now, we have a bigger problem." Grayson looked up. "Which is?" Calloway's face darkened. "I mocked her in open court." Grayson's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about losing a case anymore. They had disrespected her, and that was a mistake they would live to regret. Back in the courtroom, I remained seated, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I had been underestimated before. I had been dismissed before. But what people failed to realize was that I never walked into a courtroom unprepared. Judge Calloway and Grayson were about to learn just how wrong they had been. When the doors to the judge's chambers finally opened, all eyes turned. Judge Calloway re-entered the courtroom. But something was different. The arrogance was gone. The smirk was gone. Instead, he looked humbled. Grayson followed behind him, his face stiff with discomfort. Judge Calloway sat down, adjusted his robe, and cleared his throat. "This court will now reconvene." Silence fell over the room. He turned to me, and for the first time since this trial began, his voice was steady. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly, "before we proceed, I'd like to ask you a question." I raised an eyebrow. "Go on." He hesitated. Then with careful precision, he asked, "Why did you walk away from law all those years ago?" The entire courtroom went still. It was an unexpected question. A deeply personal one. And for the first time, my expression shifted. I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against the table. "That's not relevant to this case." "Your Honor." Judge Calloway leaned forward. "Maybe not. But I'd still like to know." The room buzzed with quiet anticipation. I looked at him for a long moment. Then finally, I sat back in my chair, my expression unreadable, and in a voice quieter than before, I said, "I walked away because I learned that justice doesn't always win." The words hit the courtroom like a punch. Even Judge Calloway seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Michael Grayson shifted uncomfortably. Ethan, sitting beside me, glanced at me with quiet concern. But before anyone could ask me to elaborate, I leaned forward slightly, my sharpness returning. But that was a long time ago. I continued, and right now, we have a case to finish. Don't we? Judge Calloway studied me for a moment longer. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yes. He turned to Grayson. Does the prosecution have anything else to present? Grayson's face was tense, his body stiff. He looked as if he wanted to be anywhere but here. After a long pause, he exhaled sharply and shook his head. No, Your Honor. Judge Calloway nodded again. Then he turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, given the evidence presented today, I see no reason to prolong this case any further. The entire courtroom tensed. The moment had arrived. Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses, took a breath, and said the words that sealed my victory. This court rules in favor of Miss Margaret Whitmore. A stunned silence followed, and then, applause, gasps, cheers. Ethan grinned. You did it, he whispered. I let out a slow breath, my lips twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. Of course I did, I murmured. I never lose. Across the room, Judge Calloway rubbed his temples. He had walked into this case thinking he was the most powerful person in the room. Now he knew better. But just as I gathered my things, preparing to leave the courtroom victorious, something unexpected happened. A voice called out from behind me. Margaret Whitmore, it said. The voice was slow, familiar, dripping with an old kind of arrogance. I turned, and standing in the courtroom doorway, watching me with the kind of smirk I hadn't seen in years, was Jonathan Pierce. And just like that, everything changed. For a long moment, I simply stared. Jonathan Pierce. I hadn't seen him in over 30 years. Not since the day he fell from grace in the most spectacular way possible. A former district attorney. A man once considered untouchable, until I exposed him for what he truly was. A fraud. A liar. A man who built his career on wrongful convictions, bribery, and intimidation. And now, somehow, he was standing in front of me, looking just as smug as he had all those years ago. Well, he drawled, stepping forward as if he owned the room. Still making headlines. I see. The murmurs in the courtroom had died down. People were watching, waiting, sensing something far bigger than a simple zoning case had just walked through the door. Ethan stiffened beside me. Miss Whitmore? Who is that? I exhaled slowly, my eyes never leaving Pierce. A name I thought I'd never hear again. Pierce chuckled, shoving his hands into his pockets. Oh, come on now, Margaret. You wound me. After all, I owe my early retirement to you. Judge Calloway was watching this unfold with a mix of confusion and unease. Mr. Pierce, what is the meaning of this? Pierce turned his gaze to the judge, giving him a polite nod. I do apologize for the interruption. Your Honor, I simply came to offer my congratulations to Miss Whitmore. His smirk deepened. It's not every day you see an old dog pull off one last trick. The insult rolled off me like water. I had dealt with men like Pierce my entire life. Men who believed that power was something you could hoard. Something that could never be challenged. He was wrong. He had always been wrong. I took a step forward, my voice calm. You're back. Pierce's smirk didn't falter. That I am. Ethan shifted beside me, his hands tightening into fists. But you, he hesitated, his voice uncertain. You were disbarred. Pierce shrugged lazily. What can I say? Some people didn't like the way I handled things. He turned back to me, tilting his head. But you already knew that, didn't you, Margaret? My jaw tightened, but my voice remained steady. What do you want, Pierce? His grin faded just slightly. To talk. I raised an eyebrow. We have nothing to discuss. Oh, I think we do. His voice lowered, just enough that only I could hear. Because I'm not done with this city yet. I felt Ethan shift beside me, his tension radiating through the air. I didn't react. I had faced Pierce before. I had brought him down before. And if I had to do it again, I would. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black envelope. Consider this an invitation. He held it out to me, his eyes gleaming with something dangerous. One I strongly suggest you accept. I didn't move. Pierce chuckled and set the envelope on the table instead. I'll give you some time to think about it. His smile sharpened. But don't take too long. And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving only silence in his wake. Ethan let out a shaky breath. Miss Whitmore, what just happened? I stared at the envelope, my fingers hovering over it. War, I murmured. Ethan swallowed. What? I lifted my gaze to the doors Pierce had just walked through. Jonathan Pierce is back, I said quietly, and that means this city is in trouble. The days that followed were a blur of movement. I had spent my career fighting men like Pierce, men who thought they could control the world from behind the scenes. But I knew better. Corruption never truly disappeared. It simply went underground, waiting for the right moment to crawl back into the light. And now, it was back. Pierce wasn't working alone. He never had. There were people in high places who had protected him. People who had allowed him to return. I needed to find out who they were. Ethan and I worked tirelessly, tracking old connections, following the money, searching for any sign of how Pierce had clawed his way back into power. And then we found it. A shadow bank. Hawthorne Financial Trust. The name on the paperwork sent a chill down my spine. Senator William Hawthorne. Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. He's the one backing Pierce. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about one corrupt man returning to the game. This was bigger, much bigger. We had to act fast. Midnight. Hawthorne Financial Trust. The building was sleek, modern, the kind of place that blended into the city like it had always belonged there. But I knew better. Ethan shifted beside me, his nervous energy palpable. This is insane, he whispered. I adjusted my jacket. If we don't do this, Pierce wins. We stepped inside. The receptionist barely glanced at me as I approached. Name? I smiled coldly. Margaret Whitmore. She picked up the phone, murmuring something. Then, without hesitation, she gestured toward the elevator. Go on up. He's expecting you. Ethan stiffened. He? I already knew. Jonathan Pierce. We stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut with a finality that sent a chill through my bones. This was it, one way or another. It ended tonight. The top floor was silent, expansive windows stretching across the skyline. And standing in the center of the room, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, was Jonathan Pierce. His smirk was slow, confident. You've been busy. I stepped forward. So have you. He sighed, shaking his head. You know, when I heard you were back, I wasn't sure if I should be impressed or disappointed. I smiled coldly. Funny, I was thinking the same thing about you. His expression darkened just slightly. You should have stayed gone. Margaret. My voice was like steel. So should you. Silence stretched between us. Then Pierce smirked. Well, he said, let's see who wins this time. The city lights gleamed outside, casting long shadows across the floor. And the war began. The sun was rising over Chicago, casting golden light across the skyline. The city had barely begun to wake. But for me, the battle was already over. Jonathan Pierce had fallen. Again. The headlines were already spreading. Disgraced former DA Jonathan Pierce arrested in major corruption scandal. Senator William Hawthorne under federal investigation for money laundering and criminal conspiracy. The web of corruption had been untangled, and the men who had controlled the city from the shadows were finally being exposed. I stood on the courthouse steps, watching as reporters swarmed, microphones clutched in eager hands, cameras flashing. Beside me, Ethan Carter was still trying to process it all. I still can't believe we actually did it, he murmured. I exhaled, adjusting my coat. It's not over yet. Ethan frowned. But Pierce is done. Hawthorne is finished. What else is left? I glanced at him, a small smile tugging at my lips. Justice doesn't stop at an arrest. Ethan, it's a fight you keep showing up for, every single day. He studied me for a long moment. And you're going to keep fighting, aren't you? I turned back to the city. My home, my battlefield. I never really stopped. As the wind carried the sounds of the waking city, I knew one thing for certain. Powerful men would always try to rewrite the rules in their favor. But as long as I was here, as long as I had breath in my body, I would never let them win. The law was my weapon. And I was never laying it down. Subscribe to Life Stories for more powerful narratives.